The message came through every screen, every speaker, and every radio signal in the known galaxy at exactly the same moment. It did not ask for attention. It did not need to. When the sovereignty of Var spoke, every living thing in space stopped what it was doing and listened. Commander Nathan Cole was eating a cold sandwich at his post aboard the orbital defense platform above Earth when the broadcast hit. The lights in the control room flickered once. Then every monitor went blue, and a deep, mechanical voice began to speak in perfect English, in every language at once, somehow. The sovereignty of Var hereby declares a state of war against the human species of the planet Earth. Humanity represents a biological and psychological threat to the stability of galactic civilization. All human military assets are to be surrendered within 72 hours. Failure to comply will result in total planetary suppression. Nathan put his sandwich down. Around him, the control room had gone completely silent. 23 trained military professionals sat or stood at their stations with their mouths open. One of the younger officers, a kid named Pete, slowly turned in his chair and looked at Nathan like he expected an answer. Nathan had no answer. Not yet. Down on Earth, the reaction was much the same. In New York, in London, in Delhi, in Lagos, and in every city in between, people stopped walking and looked up at the sky as if they expected to see something there. Some did not move for a long time. The Galactic Accord, the great interstellar body that humanity had joined 40 years ago as a minor trading partner, called an emergency session within the hour. Ambassador Priya Okafor, humanity's voice in that assembly, was already at her seat when the session opened. She was a calm woman by nature. She had spent 20 years learning how to be calm in rooms full of beings that did not think or feel the way she did. But even she felt the cold weight of what was happening as delegate after delegate stood and expressed deep regret without offering anything else. The Surath said it was a matter between humanity and the various. The Kaloni said they hoped for a peaceful resolution. The Dravari ambassador didn't speak at all. One by one, the members of the Accord looked away. Priya sat very still and wrote nothing on her notepad. Back on the defense platform, Nathan had pulled up every piece of intelligence they had on the various. He had read most of it before. The sovereignty was a coalition of 7 civilizations spread across a wide band of the galaxy. They were old, disciplined, and armed in ways that made human warships look like riverboats next to ocean liners. Their declared reason for war was thin, humanity as a threat to galactic stability, but Nathan had been a soldier long enough to know that stated reasons were rarely real ones. His communications officer told him that Defense Minister Leon Hargrove was calling a global war council within the hour. Nathan acknowledged the message and went back to his data. 40 warships. That was the size of the Var fleet moving toward the solar system. 40. Nathan looked at the human inventory. It wasn't embarrassing, but it wasn't enough either. Not on paper. On paper. In the War Council chamber, Leon Hargrove walked in last. He was a large man with a gray beard and eyes that had seen a number of things most people never had to. He placed an old military planning file on the table, actual paper, not a screen, and looked around at the assembled generals, admirals, and ministers without saying anything for a long moment. Then he said, quietly, that humanity had been in worse corners before. Nobody argued with him. Not because they agreed, necessarily, but because something in the way he said it made the room feel slightly less cold. Up on the platform, Nathan stood at the observation window and looked down at Earth. City lights glowed through the cloud cover like embers. 7 billion people going about their evening or their morning or their middle of the night, most of them now fully aware that something enormous and terrifying had just been announced. He thought about what that meant. Not the military math of it. Not the odds. Just the fact of it, that somewhere out there, a group of civilizations had looked at humanity, decided it was a problem to be removed, and sent 40 ships to do the job. Something stirred in Nathan's chest. It was not fear, exactly. It was older than fear. It was the feeling a person gets when someone tells them they cannot do something that they have been doing their whole life. The 72-hour clock had started. The Var were expecting a response. What they were going to get was something they had not planned for, but Nathan didn't know that yet. Nobody did. He just felt the old feeling and knew, without knowing how he knew, that this was going to go differently than anyone expected. Including him. The Var fleet arrived at the edge of the solar system with the calm confidence of people who had done this before. Their formation was clean and precise. Their communications were disciplined. Their commanders had reviewed the human military inventory and run the numbers. The numbers said this would be over in a week, maybe 2. They sent a follow-up transmission to Earth on hour 48 of the 72-hour deadline. It was professional in tone. It listed, again, the terms of surrender. It noted that resistance would only increase the final cost. Defense Minister Leon Hargrove received the transmission in his office, read it once, and dictated a reply. The reply was 3 sentences. It said that humanity had considered the terms. It said that humanity declined. It said that if the VAR fleet crossed the boundary marker at Jupiter's orbit, humanity would treat it as an act of war and respond accordingly. The reply was sent. The clock ran down. The VAR crossed the boundary. The first engagement happened near one of Jupiter's outer moons. A VAR scout squadron, 12 ships, moved in ahead of the main fleet to knock out a network of communication relays that humanity had strung across that part of the system. It was a standard opening move. Disable communications first, isolate the enemy, make them feel blind and alone. Captain Diana Ford was waiting for them with 9 ships. What happened next lasted 40 minutes. The VAR scout commander, a decorated officer named something that translated roughly as second of the tide, later reported to his superiors that the human ships had not behaved like a defending force. They had behaved like a hunting one. They came in at odd angles with no apparent concern for their own safety, pressing close where VAR doctrine suggested enemies would pull back, and using a layered communication system that his jamming equipment couldn't fully disrupt. By the end of 40 minutes, 8 of the 12 VAR scouts were destroyed. The other 4 retreated. Diana Ford lost 2 ships. She pressed her surviving 7 forward and held the relay position. On the VAR command ship, there was a long silence after the report came in. The fleet admiral reviewed the numbers. 12 to 9, and he had lost 8. That was not a rounding error. That was a problem. His projections had accounted for human resistance, low morale, limited tactical experience, outdated hardware. They had not accounted for this. What the VAR didn't know, and hadn't thought to look into, was that humanity had spent 40 years as a peaceful trading partner while quietly keeping its military thinking sharp. Not because humans were planning anything aggressive, but because they had a long and very detailed history of what happened when you stopped thinking about defense, and that history had made them careful. Old habits. Nathan was reassigned 3 days into the conflict to lead a forward defense group, a loose collection of 7 ships with orders to slow the VAR advance and buy time for Earth to finalize its wartime production lines. It was not a glamorous assignment. It was a grinding one. His group skirmished with VAR advance elements twice in the first week, took damage, fell back, repaired where they could, and went back out. During those days, Nathan began to understand something he couldn't quite put into words yet. The VAR were good. Their ships were better. Their weapons hit harder. But they fought with a certain expectation that when you pushed, the other side would consider retreating. It was a rational expectation. Most species in the galaxy, when faced with a superior force, would look at the math and step back. Humans looked at the math and got irritated. Out on Titan, in a research station that officially didn't appear on any military inventory, a scientist named Aaron Briggs was doing something that his supervisor had officially told him 3 times to stop doing. He was running calculations on a drive prototype that the Titan facility had been quietly developing for 6 years. The drive was theoretically capable of moving a ship across the solar system in a fraction of the time the VAR's models predicted was possible. Theoretically. The actual test data was incomplete. The actual test data suggested a 40% chance that the drive would tear the ship apart on the first activation. Aaron ran the numbers again. Then he ran them a 3rd time. He wrote the results on a piece of paper, actual paper. He found paper helped him think, and sat with it for a while. He didn't tell anyone yet. But he didn't stop working either. Back at the Jupiter engagement zone, Diana Ford's group was running low on ammunition and fuel when a resupply ship finally reached them. The crew of the resupply ship expected to find a battered and shaken unit. They found Diana's people running combat drills in their flight suits, laughing about something. When the resupply crew asked what was funny, one of Diana's pilots said they just figured out a maneuver that the VAR's targeting systems apparently couldn't predict. The resupply crew went home and told people about that. Word spread. On Earth, something was shifting. The VAR had expected that the broadcast, the show of force, the deadline, all of it, would produce a population that would push its government toward surrender. What actually happened was something different. People were afraid, yes. But fear in humans had a complicated relationship with behavior. It didn't always produce surrender. Sometimes it produced something else entirely. Nathan didn't have a name for it yet. He just knew, watching his own crew, watching Diana's reports, watching the numbers that kept coming out wrong for the VAR, that whatever they were expecting humanity to do, it wasn't this. And he found, somewhere underneath the exhaustion and the worry, that he was grinning. By the third week of the war, the VAR Fleet Admiral had made a decision. His initial strategy, direct military engagement, force a quick surrender, was not producing the expected results. The human military was smaller than his, weaker than his, and had no business still being in the field. But it was still in the field. So he changed the strategy. If the soldiers wouldn't break, he would go around them. The new targets were supply lines, communication hubs, power stations, and the orbital habitation platforms that housed civilian workers and their families. The logic was old and simple. Destroy the things a population needs to live, and the population will demand its government stop the fighting. It was a sound strategy. It had worked on other species. Colonel Maya Sutton found out about the new strategy the hard way. She was second in command of the lunar garrison, a defense post on the moon's near side that guarded one of the main communication relays for Earth's military network. Her commanding officer, Colonel Wade, was killed in the first VAR strike on the garrison on day 21. Maya took command of the post before the smoke had cleared. She had 287 personnel, enough ammunition for roughly 2 weeks of sustained defense, a collection of vehicles that were designed for construction and mining rather than warfare, and a VAR ground force of around 800 soldiers advancing toward her position. She called a short meeting. She told her people what they had. She told them what was coming. She said that she intended to hold the garrison until relief arrived, and that if anyone had a better idea they should say so now. Nobody said so. Maya spent the next 3 days turning the garrison into something that looked less like a military post and more like a very angry obstacle course. Cargo containers were stacked and bolted into barricades. Mining equipment was repurposed as makeshift artillery. Her engineering team rigged motion sensors and lighting rigs across a 2-kilometer perimeter. A medic named Charlie set up a field hospital in the deepest part of the facility and started organizing supplies by injury type before anyone had even been hurt. When the VAR ground force arrived, they found that the garrison was much harder to walk into than their scanners had suggested. The fighting went on for 11 days. On Earth, the civilian population was doing something that the VAR's strategic models had not predicted. It was adapting. Engineers who worked for power companies started rerouting electricity through backup systems that hadn't been used in decades, finding paths around the nodes the VAR had destroyed. In Kansas City, a retired electrical engineer named Frank spent 4 days working from a coffee shop on a rerouting solution that eventually kept lights on in 3 states. He didn't ask anyone's permission. He just did it. Doctors moved field stations into subway tunnels and basements, away from the surface strikes. Hospital ships that had been in dry dock for years were quietly put back into service. Farmers, actual farmers, with actual soil, began using preservation and storage techniques from old handbooks, ones that didn't depend on refrigeration or power grids. Food started moving in ways that the VAR's targeting systems weren't tracking because they weren't looking at horse carts and river barges. In Cleveland, a retired naval officer named George Adler climbed down into his basement, dusted off a shortwave radio setup he had kept for hobby purposes, and started coordinating civilian defense volunteers across 4 continents. He had no official authority. He had no budget. He had a notebook, a radio, and 40 years of knowing how organizations worked. Within 6 days, George's network was moving critical supplies more efficiently than the official backup systems. Ambassador Priya Okafor, still stationed aboard the Galactic Accord platform, had not been idle. She had stopped asking for help. She had understood, after the first week, that asking was not going to produce results. The neutral species of the Accord had their own interests and their own fears, and none of them were going to step in front of the VAR for humanity's sake. So she changed her approach. She started compiling evidence. Records of VAR territorial expansion in sectors that the Accord's own treaties designated as protected space. Communications logs that showed VAR member states coordinating the war declaration months before it was announced. well before any alleged human threat had materialized. Financial records that suggested the VAR's real interest was in the mineral-rich asteroid belt that ran through human-controlled space. She didn't ask for intervention. She asked for witnesses. She invited neutral delegates to review the files. She presented the information with the quiet, unhurried patience of someone who had decided that the truth was a weapon and was learning how to use it. 14 neutral species formally requested documentation copies. Back on the moon, Maya's garrison held. She lost 41 people in 11 days. She never forgot any of their names. She wrote each one down in a small book she kept in her jacket pocket, because she thought that was the least she could do. When the VAR ground force finally pulled back to wait for reinforcements, Maya reorganized her remaining personnel and held a short ceremony for the dead. Then she told everyone to eat, sleep for 4 hours, and report back for drills. Nathan, fighting his own grinding campaign in the outer system, received reports of the lunar defense and read them carefully. He noted the ammunition expenditure, the personnel count, the length of the engagement. Then he noted something else, that Maya's unit had repelled a force nearly 3 times their size using equipment that wasn't designed for war. He added that to the list of things he was keeping in his head. The list of things that didn't match the VAR's expectations. The cost of the war was real. Ships were gone. People were dead. The communications network was damaged and working at reduced capacity. The VAR had more ships, more soldiers, and more resources, and they were using all of them. But the VAR were spending more than they had planned to spend. A lot more. And they still hadn't broken anything. Aaron Briggs had run the numbers so many times that he no longer needed to look at them. They lived in his head now, spinning quietly behind everything else he did. The 40% failure probability. The power requirements. The precise moment of activation that would either move the ship faster than anything in the solar system or tear it apart at the molecular level. He had been told no by 3 people in the chain of command. His direct supervisor, who had used the word reckless. A safety review board, which had used the phrase unacceptable risk. And a fleet operations officer, who had said, with genuine frustration, that they could not afford to lose a ship and its crew on a science experiment in the middle of a war. Aaron had listened to all 3. He had nodded in the appropriate places. He had said he understood. Then he went back to his lab on Titan, made himself a cup of coffee, and started preparing the drive for activation. He left a detailed set of notes on his desk for whoever came in after him. The notes explained everything, how the drive worked, what the calibration settings meant, what to do if the first test produced unexpected data. He wrote the notes carefully and in simple language, because he wanted them to be useful regardless of what happened next. He told no one where he was going. He took a single-pilot test vessel out of the Titan dock at 0340 on a Tuesday morning, logged it as a routine systems check, and activated the drive at a safe distance from the station. The drive worked. The ship moved. Not in the way ships normally moved, not the gradual acceleration of a standard drive pushing against space, but in the way a stone skips across water. Here, then there, with a gap in between that physics was going to have to think about for a while. Aaron sat in his pilot seat and looked at his navigation display. He was on the other side of the solar system. He had moved from Titan to a point near Mercury's orbit in 11 seconds. He sat with that for a moment. Then he opened a channel to Fleet Command and told them what he had done. There was a very long silence on the other end. Then the fleet operations officer who had told him no came back on the line and, after a pause that suggested several emotions happening at the same time, told Aaron to bring the ship back and not to touch anything else until a full team could review the data. Aaron said he would be happy to do that. The review took 36 hours. At the end of it, Nathan Cole was pulled out of a patrol mission and told to report to an emergency briefing. He arrived to find Aaron sitting at a table covered in data screens, looking like a man who hadn't slept in 2 days and didn't particularly care. The briefing was short. Nathan asked 3 questions. Then he spent 4 hours planning. The VAR fleet, by this point, had consolidated its position in the inner system. 3 of the 7 member state fleets had moved close to Earth, preparing for what their commanders believed would be a final pressure campaign. Their models showed that human resistance was finite. The math said it had to be. Sooner or later, the supplies would run out, the morale would break, the government would make the call. They were still running those models when Nathan's strike group appeared inside their formation perimeter. Not outside, waiting to engage. Inside, between the ships, in the gaps where VAR doctrine said nothing should be able to travel because the travel time was physically impossible. The engagement lasted 6 hours. Nathan's group was outnumbered 4-1. They hit the command ships first, the communication and coordination vessels that held the formation together, and then the weapons supply ships that the forward fleet depended on. It was not a fight for territory. It was surgery, and it was performed by people who had been running, adapting, and fighting for 3 weeks and had gotten very good at all 3 things. When it was over, the VAR formation had broken into 3 pieces. 2 of the 7 member state commanders were requesting independent contact with Fleet Command. 1 was requesting a ceasefire. The VAR Fleet Admiral sat in his command room and tried to understand what had just happened. He had planned for human resistance. He had adjusted for human stubbornness. He had not, and he understood this now with complete clarity, planned for humans who could appear inside his formation from nowhere and dismantle it from the center. He sent a message to his high command. In it, he wrote that he could not fully account for human behavior. He had given them a clear and reasonable option to surrender, and they had not taken it. He had struck at their infrastructure, and they had rebuilt around it. He had pushed, and instead of calculating retreat, they had pushed back harder. He wrote that they had grinned. He meant it as a note of confusion. The humans he had observed in the final engagement had not looked like desperate defenders. They had looked like people who had found what they were looking for. Nathan heard about the Admiral's message secondhand, from his communications officer, who read it aloud with a tone of mild disbelief. Nathan thought about it for a moment. Then he said the Admiral wasn't wrong. On the moon, the relief shuttle for Maya's garrison finally arrived. The crew inside had prepared for a difficult scene: low supplies, shaken personnel, a unit that had been through the worst kind of grinding weeks-long siege. They docked and came through the airlock to find Maya's people in the courtyard running formation drills. Maya herself came to meet the relief commander at the dock. She asked about resupply timelines and whether the communication relay was back online. The relief commander stared at her for a moment and then answered her questions. Later, he told people that she had seemed, if anything, slightly bored. George Adler's volunteer network, which had been running on shortwave radio and handwritten notes and the kind of stubborn goodwill that didn't show up in any official planning document, had by this point kept critical civilian systems running for over 2 weeks. Several government departments, reviewing what had actually worked during the crisis, quietly copied his organizational structure into their formal emergency protocols. George didn't know about any of that. He was in his basement, on his radio, arguing with a logistics coordinator in Sao Paulo about the best route to move a shipment of medical supplies. Around a destroyed highway junction. He was winning the argument. Priya Okafor presented her compiled evidence to the full Accord Assembly on the same day as the fleet engagement. The timing was not planned. It was just how things fell. She stood before the delegates of 14 species who had agreed to witness the proceedings and laid out, piece by piece, what the VAR had done and what their real motivations had been. She did not raise her voice. She did not make emotional appeals. She simply presented the truth in the clearest possible order and let it sit in the room. 14 species formally called for an inquiry. The Accord voted to open a full review of the VAR's conduct. The VAR, who had calculated that no one in the Accord would care enough to act, had not calculated for a human who had spent 3 weeks doing nothing but talking to people and writing things down. The war did not end with a final great battle. It ended the way a fire ends when you take away everything it was burning, gradually, in stages, with the last heat taking longer to leave than anyone expected. The first VAR member state to formally withdraw from the Sovereignty's war mandate was the Kelith Union, one of the smaller members of the coalition. Their withdrawal came 4 days after Nathan's strike on the inter-system fleet. They cited, in careful diplomatic language, concerns about the validity of the original war declaration and a desire to seek independent resolution with humanity. 2 more followed within a week. Then a 4th. The remaining 3 member states negotiated a ceasefire through back channels that opened quietly, without announcement, conducted by diplomats who preferred not to appear in news reports. The final terms took 10 days to finalize. The VAR ceded the contested asteroid belt sectors that Priya's evidence had identified as illegally held territory. There were no reparations. Humanity did not ask for them. What humanity asked for, through Priya's careful and precise diplomatic language, was acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that the war declaration had been based on fabricated justification. Acknowledgement that the VAR had acted in violation of Accord treaties. Acknowledgement that humanity had the right to exist in space without being considered a problem to be managed. The VAR signed the acknowledgement. It took 3 of their member states several days to agree on the exact wording, but they signed. The Galactic Accord convened a full review session 2 weeks after the ceasefire. It was one of the largest sessions in the Accord's history. Delegates who had said nothing during the war now had to sit in that room and explain themselves to a body that had, for the first time in a long time, been forced to examine its own behavior. Several of them admitted, in careful and indirect language, that they had expected humanity to fall quickly. That they had been watching to see which side would win before committing to anything. That they had not imagined they would be sitting in a room reviewing a ceasefire that humanity had negotiated from a position of survival rather than defeat. One delegate from the Surith said, quietly, that they had underestimated the species from the 3rd planet. He did not elaborate. He didn't need to. Nathan Cole was offered a promotion to Fleet Admiral 3 days after the ceasefire. He sat with the offer for a day, then asked instead to be assigned to the new Joint Patrol Program, a joint initiative between humanity and several neutral species to monitor the VAR border and ensure that the ceasefire terms were being honored. The officer who made the offer told him that the Joint Patrol assignment was a step down from Fleet Admiral. Nathan said he was aware of that. He said he would rather be where things were actually happening than where things were being named and recorded. He was reassigned to the patrol program. Aaron Briggs was called into a formal review board the week after the ceasefire and asked to hand over all data related to the prototype drive system. He did so. He handed over every file, every log, every calculation, every test record. The review board spent 2 days going through it all. They did not ask him what he had kept in his head. He did not tell them. He went back to Titan. His lab was exactly as he had left it. The coffee cup from the morning he had decided to activate the drive without permission was still on his desk. He washed it out and made a fresh cup and got back to work. Maya Sutton returned to Earth for the first time in over 2 years on a cold morning in late autumn. She took a transport down to a small town on the North Carolina coast, rented a room at a quiet place near the water, and spent 3 days walking on the beach without talking to anyone. She bought a sandwich from a food stand on the 2nd day and ate it sitting on a piece of driftwood looking at the waves. On the 4th day, she reported back for duty. George Adler shut down his basement radio operation the morning after the ceasefire was announced. He packed up his equipment methodically, labeled everything, and put it in storage. Then he went upstairs and had breakfast. His neighbor came over and asked him if he had heard the news. George said he had. His neighbor asked how he felt about it. George said he was glad it was over. Then he poured another cup of coffee and asked his neighbor if he wanted one. Priya Okafor was invited to address the full Galactic Accord Assembly 1 month after the ceasefire. It was a formal occasion. The chamber was filled with delegates from 47 species. Everyone was dressed in whatever their species considered appropriate for significant moments. Priya stood at the speaker's podium and looked out at the assembly for a long moment before she spoke. Her speech was short. She did not talk about victory, because she did not think of it as a victory in the way that word usually meant. She talked about what humanity had learned from the war, not tactics, not technology, but something older. She said that her species had been afraid many times in its history. Afraid of its own kind, afraid of the dark, afraid of the future. That fear had not always made humanity act well. It had sometimes made humanity act very badly indeed. But she said that fear and still moving forward at the same time was something her people knew how to do. That grinning at a thing that frightened you wasn't denial. It was a reminder, to yourself and to whoever was watching, that you had been afraid before and you were still here. She said that humanity had not fought because it was certain it would win. It had fought because surrender meant losing something more important than territory. It meant losing the understanding of what you were willing to stand up for. She paused for a moment and looked at the delegates. She said that she hoped the Accord would remember what it had nearly allowed to happen. That silence in the face of injustice was still a choice. That looking away was still a decision. She said this without anger. She said it the way a person says something they have thought about for a long time and decided is simply true. The assembly was quiet for several seconds after she sat down. Out at the edge of the solar system, on a routine patrol route that nobody had thought important enough to automate, Nathan Cole flew a slow loop through a stretch of space that would have looked empty to most people. The stars were very bright out here. The sun was just another light among many, distinguishable mainly because he knew which one to look for. He thought about the Admiral's message, about the word Grinned, about the fact that somewhere in a VAR command room, an experienced military officer had tried to describe humanity, and the best word he had found was that one. Nathan considered that for a while. He thought about Maya on her moon, about Diana at Jupiter, about Aaron and his 40% odds, about George in his basement, about Priya standing at a podium in front of 47 species and telling them the quiet truth. He thought about how the galaxy had been out here for a very long time, getting used to the idea that it understood how things worked, how species behaved, what the math said. He thought that the galaxy might need a little time to update its models. He found that funny. Not loud funny. The other kind. The kind that settled in your chest and stayed there. He keyed in the next leg of his patrol route and flew on into the dark, grinning at nothing in particular, which was, he thought, probably the most human thing he had ever done.